Welcome to the WPA OG Podcast. In this episode, we're thrilled to be joined by retired General Stan McChrystal, class of 1976, and guest speaker for the class of 2026 Affirmation Ceremony. General McChrystal shares his journey from a struggling cadet to becoming a four-star general and a former commander of U.S. and international security assistance forces in Afghanistan with USCC Brigade Tactical Officer Colonel Mike Kloepper. They delve into themes of commitment and leadership, exploring the significance of West Point's Affirmation Ceremony and the varied perspectives cadets have regarding their future military service. Please enjoy this episode with our host, Colonel Mike Kloepper.
Well, sir, I'll just open with I really appreciate the time and the opportunity to sit down with you for an hour. For me, this is, it's an honor, and I just really appreciate it.
Well, Mike, let me thank you for having me, but more, let me thank you for what you're doing. You got an important job right now. You've done a lot in the Army already, and you're having an effect on the future right now. So thanks for that.
Fingers crossed, I hope. So with one of the things about being the brigade tactical officer is it all comes flooding back. West Point comes flooding back, and you start to reflect on your cadet experiences that have influenced your time in service, like in ways that I hadn't necessarily thought about, before walking around Central Area again. And I guess, sir, I would just want to start at the beginning with you as a cadet, and if you could just share anything, or as you reflect on the things you learned at West Point or that experience, if there's something that you have found that you have anchored to over your decades of service, I think that'd probably be the right foundation to lay. Sir?
I'll start that I entered in the summer of 1972, and West Point was not going through one of its easiest periods. It was the Vietnam War was winding down. There were some issues with the U.S. Army in general, perception of the military. But I was the son and grandson of Army officers, the son of a West Point graduate from the class of 1945. And I knew from a young age I wanted to be an Army officer. And I wanted to be as close to my father in the model that he was as I could be. And so I went to West Point to be an Army officer, not to be a West Point cadet. In fact, I had never thought that much about West Point, except it was just something you had to do to go be an Army officer. And so my father had never been stationed there. I'd never spent time there. And so when I went to West Point, I went with a positive and negative about the attitude. A positive was I had no doubt I wanted to be an Army officer. But I didn't take West Point seriously as a goal, either academically or in any other way. So when I entered at age 17 in the summer of 1972, I'm treating West Point sort of like a toll booth I was going to go through for 4 years, and then I was going to go be an Army officer and get on with my life. So I didn't pay attention to a lot of the things that mattered at West Point. Some of them I started to after a couple years, but I got there with an attitude that I was going to get away with as much as I could get away with. Academics were not going to be really important to me, and I was already weak in math, so that showed up pretty quickly. So as a consequence, on the one hand, I think it helped me be a cadet because I didn't have any doubt that I wanted to graduate, but I didn't have the serious focus to let me be a good cadet for quite a long time until after I got there. My first 2 years were extraordinarily painful. I was very low academically because plebe math tortured me, and then yearling year with some of the science that tortured me as well. I got in massive trouble in terms of discipline. I got 4 slugs. I got slugged at the end of Beast Barracks while I was a new cadet still, and that doesn't happen very often. So I showed up to my first company, B1, with a slug. And so that kind of identified me in not a positive way. And then through the course of the next 2 years, I got 3 more significant slugs. So by the end of yearling year, I was in trouble demerit-wise. And I was pretty low academically. So I I finished those 2 years. I still didn't have any doubt I wanted to be an Army officer, but I had a doubt whether West Point and I were going to come to some kind of modus vivendi. And I started my COL year, and we got a new tactical officer in Company B1. And it was interesting because I went up to meet with him. He had a meeting with every cadet, and you just come through when your time was set. And the guy was Dave Borato, and he was class of 64, I think, and then he'd gone into Special Forces. But he sat me down, and he goes, I think you're going to be very successful in the Army, and I think you're going to be a good cadet for these next 2 years. And I remember trying to lean over to see if he had the wrong file. And I said, basically, you're talking to, right? And he goes, I know who I'm talking to. And he goes, the things that I think matter a lot, you're pretty good at. And the things that I don't think matter a lot, you haven't taken very seriously. And it was interesting because for lots of reasons, or several reasons, that was an inflection point in my time as a cadet and in my life, because those first 2 years were, I'd have to say, sort of a failure. The next 2 years, I did better academically. I did better militarily. I didn't get slugged anymore. And I started seriously dating the girl that I've now been married to for 47 years. So I attribute a lot of it to later General Borato, but then at the time, Major Dave Borato, because he exhibited confidence and faith in me at just the moment when it had a big effect. And so when I talk about, you asked the question, Mike, about what are those things you remember? I remember that sort of different from some of the other experiences I'd had at West Point. He really had a very mature, far view. You're going to be a good Army officer. You're going to be a good soldier. And that had a tremendous effect on, I think, what I thought about leadership later in my career.
Yes, sir. So with that, it's interesting that conversation occurs between your yearling and COL year, between your third and second class year, and I think what you'll see when you come up for the affirmation ceremony, this rite of passage, this positive rite of passage, has taken on a significant level of importance in the Corps. And I think what you'll find our cadets are pretty reflective and introspective about the importance of the profession, certainly in a way that I wasn't necessarily. And I guess what I would ask is, with that, in thinking about the affirmation to commission service, the affirmation of service to the nation, at what point was it, as a cadet, or was it after that you sort of affirmed not your loyalty or allegiance, but affirmed your commitment to this idea of service?
Yeah, and I think times were different in all of the eras we went through. When I went, my perception was, in my class, there was a significant number of fellow cadets who came to West Point to go to West Point. And literally, while they were cadets, they had already decided that they were going to get out as soon as they could. 5 years was our commitment. And so many of them made branch decisions and assignment decisions based upon the idea they were already going to get out and do something else. There's nothing wrong with that, but I thought that was unfortunate, because if you're going to do this much commitment to 4 years at West Point and then 5 years in the Army, you ought to give yourself options and give the Army some time to convince you that you might be a good fit for longer term. I was a bit different, and there were other cadets like me for sure. But as I mentioned, I came in wanting to be an Army officer and didn't have any doubt about that. And so when we did the affirmation, which was really just, in my class, consisted of going to class for that first day, COL year, most of us didn't think that much about it. A few people did. I had one classmate in my company who actually went until that morning and then quit. But I don't think most of us gave it the depth of thought it warranted, because you're talking about 2 more years and then some years in the Army, potentially in combat with, significant amount of potential implications. And so for me, it is something that people ought to think a lot about. Now, at the same time, I would say they shouldn't worry a lot about it. You know, you can do calculations of risk versus gain, cost versus benefit, all these things, and you don't know. It is intuition. And so I think if somebody is coming to a big decision like this, you ought to do the best you can to think about it, decide, and then throw yourself into it, because there's a probability or possibility you got it wrong, and you can't worry too much about it at that point. The other thing I've thought about a lot, though, is those decisions in life where we do commit. There are a number of times where we make decisions to people. We say, I will do something. A marriage is a big commitment. Having a child is a big commitment. Taking command of a unit is a big commitment, because you're essentially making a promise to every member that's affected by that, whether it's a spouse or it's a family or it's the unit. You're making a promise to them that you're going to live up to something that you said you'd do. And I think in our society today that's not as strong as it could be. And I think it is the kind of thing that we ought to give more thought to. Not be scared of those commitments, because at the end of the day, most of the commitments we make actually turn out to be tremendous benefits for us. I spent many years in the Ranger Regiment, and the Rangers, as many other organizations, had a Ranger Creed. And it was a 6-stanza creed, and essentially it's a promise to every other Ranger how you are going to conduct yourself. And you don't know every other Ranger. You know, when I was in it, it was about 2,200 people. You know a small percentage, but you're making a very significant promise. You say, I'll never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy. That's a promise that says, I will do whatever it takes to come get you, even at the cost of my life. That's an extraordinary promise to make to other people. And yet, the benefit of committing to things in life, to making those promises, to living up those commitments, I think it gives us a depth as people to our character. And I think that may be one of the most important things we do throughout our lives.
Yes, sir. So the other revelation that I've had working with the cadets is we really do an awful lot of our learning. We do an awful lot of our learning in our first assignment. I think by virtue, by virtue that young lieutenants don't know a whole lot, by virtue that we're surrounded by NCOs, by virtue, we're both susceptible, and we're surrounded by teachers. And for sure, I tell the cadets all the time that a lot of the way I am is because of my first 4 Ranger squad leaders in 275. They made me into a colonel 25 years ago. So what are those moments as you think of yourself as a younger officer, not a young, but a younger officer? What are those moments that informed you through strategic leadership? Or who are those leaders?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think we often have to go to our first and second and third assignments before we learn what we learned at West Point, meaning before it to emerge.
Right.
Because at West Point, you're exposed to a lot of things, and you're not 100% sure you are until you're out there doing it. And then suddenly you realize there were some seeds planted there that grow in a certain way, and usually good. In my first assignment, I went to the 82nd Airborne Division, and it was not good years for the 82nd. It was the late 70s. The Army was still recovering from Vietnam. Budgets were not good. Honestly, the level of leadership across the division was uneven, and we weren't very good at training. The NCO Corps was not anything like it turned out to be in the 1980s and 1990s. So it was a natural trough after a very painful war. And so I got into this unit, which was frankly disappointing. I'd grown up on stories of World War II and that sort of thing, and I expected to go to the All-American Division and find these barrel-chested freedom fighter paratroopers that, would be just people I could greatly admire. And they weren't all that way, and the organization was troubled. But when I got to know them better, when we were in the field with young paratroopers, they didn't have the same opportunities I had. They didn't have the same education. They didn't have the same socioeconomic advantages, but they were damn good people. Now, it was our job to make them good soldiers, but they were good people. And if you could connect to that, if you could recognize that, then what I found was there was this extraordinary amount that you could learn and get from them. I've told this story to people before, but in my first company, we had a supply sergeant, and he was an overweight African-American sergeant first class who wore low quarter shoes, not combat boots, in the 82nd Airborne Division. And he wore them because he'd had this bad parachute jump a few years before, shattered his leg, and he just couldn't. Before that, he'd been a hardcore airborne paratrooper. Now he's a supply sergeant in Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He looked like a bag of donuts walking around. He had vodka on his breath during duty hours pretty often. And so you'd immediately say, oh my God, that guy doesn't look like a soldier. He's not a soldier. If anything, I got to try to not learn from him. But he was the supply sergeant with a lot of power. And so I dealt with him, but I go down one day after about 3 months in the company, and he sits me down. He says, Lieutenant Mack, sit here. Let me explain something to you. And he pulls out the hand receipt that I'd signed for my platoon property on. And he said, I'm going to teach you something. And he showed me that he had all the amounts filled in out through column, we'll call it D. And then on the last page, because there was multiple pages, he'd had me sign column E. And he said, okay, you're a smart guy. You went to college. You just signed a hand receipt, and I can go in and put whatever amounts I want on the previous pages, and you're responsible for them. And he says, I was waiting to see if you're a good guy, and I've decided that you are. So let me teach you, don't ever do that. And I experienced that. And then I watched him do things for other people in the battalion and in the company that were just extraordinarily positive leadership actions for which he got very little credit. And I came to the conclusion that leadership in that unit, and at that time particularly, doesn't have to look a certain way. Doesn't have to be in spit-shine jump boots. Doesn't have to be, tall and straight-toothed and charismatic. It can be very different, and yet it can be just maybe more powerful. And that was one of those lessons that I think I've carried for the rest of my career.
Yes, sir. So to that end, as we think about the future, and you've written about, and we in the Brigade Tactical Department study some of the things you've written about. You've written about focusing on culture and the aspects of culture to prepare for the future. If the future is uncertain and we can't prepare an optimal solution for it, we can't task organize and train specifically for the problem, to focus on culture. And sir, for sure, our future is uncertain. And I mean, right on the other side of that room, we're at Gettysburg. I got 120 cadets laying out the framework of an academic year. And it's really about culture. And I guess I would just sort of ask if you could elaborate as you've learned since writing in terms of importance of culture and how to build it and how to actually do that.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that, Mike, because we experience it in our careers. Most of us can look back in the rearview mirror at units where it was very good. We felt good about it. We felt like we learned a lot. In other cases where not as true. And in almost every case, it was an intangible culture in that organization that had an effect on us as we developed what we did, how we felt in the moment, and how that organization functioned. I've had a lot more time after leaving the service to think about it, and I'm just finishing a book on character right now, because at the end of the day, I think character is part of the individual embedded part of culture that is so incredibly important. And what I've concluded is, of course, at the end of the day, the most important thing we have individually is our character. It's not our knowledge, because there are people around us who will always know more, and you can find experts to inform you. But our character is something that determines how we treat other people, what we expect of ourselves, the standards that we adhere to, and those that we represent for people. Those become critical. And if you describe culture in an organization sort of as organizational character, is there a sense of integrity? Is there, to make it simple, duty, a sense of duty, honor, and country? And creating in that organization a belief that those aren't just words, that those in fact are how we conduct ourselves. In the civilian world, I go out a lot to companies and I watch, and there'll be a statement of vision or a statement of organizational values. And in some organizations, those are the true guideposts that the organization lives to. In others, they're a case where somebody put them together with good intentions, put them on the wall, and they're kind of irrelevant. And in some cases, they're even a source of a lack of credibility for leaders, because people can see one thing and yet they know what's actually happening in the organization, the say-do gap. And so the idea of creating a culture is something that takes constant effort. And in the case of being a leader, you have to start by reflecting that culture. Everything you say and do affects that culture. And so everything you say and do has to reflect the culture you want. Or if it doesn't, it's going to impact the culture you actually get. And so it takes a tremendous amount of personal self-discipline for leaders to mold an organization in the culture, if that culture is something, the kind that I think, Mike, you and I would admire. And
Sure.
it's the most important thing an organization can do. You know, you mentioned the Battle of Gettysburg, because we all study that and other battles. The one thing I can say with a great deal of confidence is we won't fight that battle again. The battles we fight in the future will be different. And so the best you can do is prepare your people to do whatever's different, because everything, you never step in the same river twice, as Heraclitus taught us.
You mentioned how we treat people, and you, in the same sentence, you said standards and accountability. And I'll share with you, we wrestle with this. You wrote about being a gardener instead of a chess master, and you write essentially about empathetic leadership and meeting people where they are. And we wrestle with this idea of empathetic leadership and holding each other accountable. And if you're not careful, we find that those are two different ends of the same spectrum. They're not, obviously, but we're wrestling with that. Can you talk us through your perspective on empathetic leadership and holding yourself and others accountable, and how those come together?
Yeah, sure. Because I know West Point was the first place where you see, on the one hand, you can want to be popular with the people who work for you, or you can do the things that they really need. And so I start with, because you use the term empathy, empathy is not the same as sympathy. In my definition of empathy, it means I can put myself in your position as much as possible, and I can try to see the world through your eyes. I can appreciate your perspective. And of course, when I was in places like Afghanistan, you'd see someone with a different culture, a different language, a different religion, a different life's journey, and they saw the world differently than I did. And it didn't make them right, and it didn't make them wrong. It just made them different. But if I couldn't sort of step out of who I am long enough to appreciate that with their life journey, I probably would have the exact same views they do, then it's pretty hard for me to deal effectively with them. So if we first understand that empathy is the sense of understanding, it's not sympathy. It's the sense of understanding and dealing. And then the next is, what do you need for the organization, and what do those individuals need? And usually it is not short-term popularity. It is clear standards. It's consistency. It's holding people accountable to whatever standards you've set. The worst units I've ever been in have a bunch of standards and they don't follow them. You're much better to have a few standards and follow them religiously, because then people know, it's clear what it is they have to do and what they don't have to do. And so I think when we talk about dealing with people, I think it was Rommel who said, the best form of troop welfare is first-class training. That's the critical thing. Figure what individuals in the organization needs and have the courage to demand it.
Yes, sir. So the other thing that's interesting about the cadets, I could really brag on them, and I could sing the accolades of West Point. The academics are very rigorous. The military program it's as rigorous as we can make it. There's no holding back. It is as rigorous as we can make it, to do our best to prepare them for the next war. But one of the things that catches me off guard is our cadets they're very mature, and they're far more mature and thoughtful than I. And so you spent as much time almost as a general officer, as a strategic leader, as you did as a field grade and company officer. And from that perspective, from a strategic leader, I've got a cadet first captain on the other side of that wall who's developing a vision, a cadet first captain who's trying to figure out how to integrate department efforts, a cadet first captain who's trying to figure out how to achieve unity of command and effect with our athletic programs, and on and on and on. As a strategic leader, what were your most poignant lessons that I may be able to distill down in our after lunch dialogue with the cadets and here?
Yeah, I think you are doing that very well already. I think West Point, my perception is they do have a much further field of view than we tend to get in units. You remember, you go out to your first assignment, you're worried about what you're doing tomorrow and next week and whatnot, where you are trying to prepare cadets for a career, not just for their first assignment. So I think West Point does take a good long-term view. When I was a cadet, I'm not sure we communicated that to cadets quite as clearly as we might have. I'm not sure we ever communicated the importance of strategic thinking, because a percentage of you will do that, and you will need to do that. And you will be given some opportunity during your career to hone those skills. But it's important pretty early that you get exposed to the habit of thinking strategically. I think that the things that I learned belatedly in many cases about strategic leadership were, first, you've got to step back from the problem. You've got to view it at some altitude so you see it with a little less emotion, a little less granularity, but a little more clarity. I used to sometimes say you need to be able to stare at the map and blur your eyes so you only see the very big colors and things, because things will come out to you about a situation or a requirement that are clearer than when you get down in the weeds. I also think that we have a tendency sometimes to wrap ourselves around the axle. Some of the best, clearest leaders I ever dealt with were command sergeants major in my unit, and some of them who had come from pretty humble beginnings. And they came from humble beginnings and they went into the Army, and they were exposed to a set of values that the Army offered them. And they looked at that and they said, okay, I accept that. I embrace those. And so when you get along 20 years later, I'm a regimental commander, I got a sergeant major, and we've got an issue that comes up, and I'm trying to see the nuances of gray in the issue. And he just says, hey, sir, there's a right and wrong here. This is clear. And so often they were right. And you step back and you go, absolutely. And that's where I say, being strategic, sometimes you just got to be able to step back and see the right or the wrong to something. And sometimes it's moral, sometimes it's one stupid and not stupid. And then the last part about strategic communications is a huge component of it is communicating. Because you can have a brilliant idea, you can come up with the best strategy ever. If you can't communicate it to an entire constellation of stakeholders, at the very senior level, you're communicating to the president and political leaders. You're communicating to allied leaders. You're communicating to media. but you're also communicating to sergeants and privates and lieutenants. So you've got to be able to communicate to all of those different players, sometimes using slightly different tone and verbiage, but you've got to have a consistent message that every one of those groups can understand. And that takes practice. It takes effort, but it also takes practice.
Yes, sir. Sir, with that, a fair amount, a fair amount of the audience that will see this podcast has served under your command when in service, and so I'll share. I entered the Range Regiment. You were the RCO that right before I went to rope the first time. Your change of command was immediately beforehand, but we had all of your policy letters all over the place, and through your service as the task force commander, like there's a measurable percentage of our Army that knows exactly how General McChrystal operates and how you communicate and mission command over a distance. But my question would be, as you've left service and continued to learn, what have you learned that you wish you had known? If you could command again, what have you learned in your new role that if you could go back, you'd take with you back into service?
Yeah, Mike, it's terrible having so many people in the Army who served with me because they know the truth. And so it makes it hard for me to stretch the truth. But the reality is I've had the opportunity to think a lot. And after 14 years now out of service, started a business, and I deal in the commercial business world, I've had time to learn things that I wish that I had known. The first I sort of described to you there. I would be a better strategic leader now because I would be more intentional about what I just described to you. I would, you do a lot of things intuitively as a leader, and sometimes they're right. You watch somebody else do them and they work for them, or you just feels right. I've had chance to think about them and write about them, and now I would be more intentional about what I was trying to accomplish, how my role, how I was going to use everything about me, how I look, how I act, how I talk with people as one of the tools to try to be as effective as I have the ability to be for that. I would be more decisive. And, I thought I was a decisive military leader, and I think most of us did. The reality is in peacetime, most military leaders don't have much room to be very decisive. Your organization set up for you, your budget set up for you. You've got training rules, you got all these different things. So your ability, even in like units, different battalions or brigades or divisions, there's not a lot of room. You can adjust a few things. Then in combat, you actually got a lot of room to be decisive. And yet we expect people to be brought up in a peacetime environment and then suddenly get in a combat environment and be extraordinarily decisive. And we sometimes struggle. I see the best business leaders that I deal with, and they're not all this way, be extraordinarily decisive. They get up on Monday morning and they say, this company ought to be going in a completely different direction. And on Tuesday it is. And we go, wow, that's really something. But they understand that there's a lot of decisions that don't get better with delaying. They don't get better with hand-wringing. They don't get better with further analysis. Now, you don't want to be irresponsible, but there are things about that I would push harder. Now, you probably say, yeah, that's just what I need, McChrystal, to push harder.
I wouldn't know what that looks like.
To do something.
Right.
I would push harder on the things that I thought we needed to do because I was never disappointed with what organizations could do when you push them.
Yes, sir. So we're closing in on our last few minutes. I will ask you, I'm going to ask you for your closing thoughts, but I will ask you, so once upon a time, you were the Ranger Regimental Commander, and I'm sure you remember, you had some policy letters about walking, and you had us road march 20 miles one quarter and 30 miles the next quarter. And, that has really, I guess, sort of two-part question. Are you still walking? And the second question would be, we've really latched on to this idea of of building teams through shared hardship, which, as I reflect on some of those longer road marches, that's what that was about. So any closing comments, sir, on sort of team building, bringing people together, cohesion through purpose, as well as hardship, and are you still walking?
Yeah, this is going to sound sick. I still am walking. I've got a rucksack in my garage, not an Army one. It's
Yes.
civilian one, so it's got a bright color, and I still walk. And I find that's good for me because I can walk. Nowadays, I listen to books as I walk, so I couldn't do that in the Army. But your point, I think, is really important. I think the West Point experience is an awful lot of, remember we used to call it privation, and we made it a verb. We'd say we're going to go out and private this week. But at West Point, it was a lot of the whole plebe experience was about forcing people together in a situation that was challenging and unpleasant. And the whole 4 years was an awful lot about creating that dynamic as one of the many dynamics that you have at West Point. You really don't go through West Point as an individual very effectively. You do it best if you're part of this team that goes through things like that. Last night for dinner at my house, I had former number 3 guy in the CIA, who was a Marine before that, a retired British 3-star, and then tonight we're going to be joined by General John Mulholland, a retired 3-star. We're all old friends from Afghanistan, Iraq, and whatnot, and we told war stories. We told funny stories. We told stories about things we didn't do well and characters. And those bonds, which people who serve together, Mike, you've got them, and you're going to have even more after service. Those are the most sacred things. I would do anything for those people. And I would do it because of the bonds that we built up together. And so sometimes the best thing you can do for people is pressure test them. Pressure test them as individuals, pressure test them as groups, make better steel through heat. And so I would say that the opportunity to do that shouldn't be missed. And I know that sounds like an old grad saying we just got to make life harder for everybody. And I don't want to sound like that, but I do want to say that those things that I think did me the most good were not things I necessarily in the moment enjoyed.
I'll share with you just sort of from a current academy perspective. And I said before, I admire, it's not my part of the academy, but I admire the academics. It is our decisive operation. It is really good. And I would offer that's where that is a massive part of where we are building toughness and a massive part of where we're building character. To your earlier points, just to highlight the greatest challenges that you shared at West Point, your first 2 years were academic in nature. You didn't talk about calling minutes or whatever. And it's still it is still very much that way. And I'll share all of the things that you would want to be happening in the physical program are the obstacle courses, and all of those things are there. And if Colonel Fedorovich, DMI-6, and I, if we share the military program, we feel a sense of urgency to deliver the pressure and heat in a way that is positive, persistent, and present to this generation of young leader. We know they're going to win our next existential war for us. So with that, I would just ask, we've got about 5 minutes left for any sort of closing thoughts for our core or graduates or our audience at large.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And again, I'll repeat my thanks for what you and all your peers are doing to grow future cadets. And I'm going to get a chance to talk at the Affirmation Ceremony, but talking to cadets right now, you are the future of the Army. And you're not going to be the only future of the Army. There are going to be great non-commissioned officers, great warrant officers, great other people from sources of commissioning are going to come together, but you are going to be a critical part of the future of the Army of the United States. And I'm going to say this with absolute confidence. You're going to go to war. And you're going to go to war more than once in your career if you stay any length of time. We had a period when we sort of thought that wars were going to be in the past, and that was completely wrong. And I think that that's going to be completely wrong for the future. And the sad part or the hard part about going to war is it's going to be painful for everyone involved, the whole nation, but it's also going to be uncertain because we have no idea what a future war is going to look like. There's new equipment, there's new technologies, and they will all affect, but we don't know what that's going to play out like. All we know is it's going to take people who have extraordinary commitment, a tremendous amount of self-discipline so that they can conduct themselves in that kind of environment well. And then people who are adaptable. Nothing you learn right now is going to be the right answer to the problem in the future. I say that for sure. But you're learning how to think, you're learning how to problem solve, you're learning how to do those things that are going to allow you to figure it out in the moment. And that's going to be the difference between success and failure. And so, that's not me telling cadets not to pay attention to what they're being taught right now, because you are being taught how to problem solve, how to think, how to do things. It's just that none of us, certainly not my generation, I don't think any behind us, have the answers to tomorrow's test. Tomorrow's test is yours. And we're just counting on you to do well, and I'm confident that we will.
That's awesome. I'll share. I really truly appreciate the time and the chance to sit down with you personally and talk. I've got a couple of notes: pressure, heat, test, commitments, affirmation, profession, character, drives, culture. So, sir, I again appreciate the time and your influence over my last 27 years of service and the impact you've made.
Well, you're kind, Mike, and thanks for all you're doing.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for listening to the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show, and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.